Hey everybody, Chris here. Today's episode is from one of my other shows, Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. If you're already listening over there, thank you. If you're not, today is a taste of what's going on over there. Essentially, I'm telling the stories of the most important ascents from the 1990s, and then I'm talking with people who were inspired by those ascents. And today's episode includes clips from several of those conversations, including Adam Ondra, Steve McClure, Alex Megos, Ben Cossey, and Buster Martin. And we're discussing the debate over which was the first 9A, Hubble or Action Directe. And this is a fascinating topic that led me down all sorts of rabbit holes while I was researching the 90s and while I was talking with all of these amazing climbers who were inspired by the 90s. So I really wanted to do this. It was a bonus episode over on Written in Stone, but if you enjoy it, I would love for you to go over and subscribe over there and listen to what we've got going. We've only told 4 of the 10 or 11 stories we're going to be telling this season. We've got Lynn Hill, Ben Moon, Fred Nicole, and Wolfgang Gulich already out with lots more amazing stories from the 90s to come. And last thing, Written in Stone is sponsored by Tension Climbing. So if you're looking for that last minute stocking stuffer or Christmas gift, be it one of the new whetstones or hone stones or a flashboard or a tension block, you can get 10% off of those if you use the code STONE. That's STONE. Use that at checkout. You'll get 10% off. Same over at the Power Company site. Use the code STONE and you'll get a discount on just about everything. All right, let's get into it. On the 14th of June, 1990, when Ben Moon sat beneath the Whore of Babylon project and laced up his prototype Boreal Sprints, the hardest grade in the world was 8C, or 514B. Wolfgang Gulich had first established that grade in 1987 with Wall Street and the Frankengura. And in 1988, Fred Nicole had added an 8C of his own, and Ben Moon himself had recently done a pair of them in France. And just a few months earlier, the UK had gotten its first, Liquid Amber, at the hands of Jerry Moffat. But Ben knew this project was harder, so when he clipped the chains and lowered back to the base of Raventor, he had a decision to make. And his decision was to make a statement. Hubble, 8C+, 14C, the first in the world. A little over a year later, in September of 91, Wolfgang Gulich stood beneath the intimidating limestone bulge in the Waldkopf in the Frankengura. He'd been trying it on and off while training specifically for the route on a device he'd invented just for that, the campus board. And when he stuck the finishing lunge and mantled onto the mossy pedestal on top of the new route, Action Directe, he too faced that same decision. What many of us think is that he gave Action Directe 9A, making it the first in the world, harder than Hubble, the only 8C+ in the world at the time. End of discussion. But that's not really what happened. Wolfgang didn't give his route 9A. In reality, neither route was originally given the grade of 9A or 14D, and soon after, Ben Moon himself would argue vehemently that his route was not 9A. Yet today, the two routes are hotly debated as contenders for the world's first. In this bonus episode, we're going to examine the circumstances, discuss where the debate began, and hear from the only 2 people in the world who have climbed both routes, Alex Megos and Buster Martin, to try and decide once and for all which route was really the world's first 9A. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to a bonus episode of Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is Season 1, the 1990s.
1, 2.
So it went like this. Ben believed his new route, Hubble, was harder than anything he'd climbed. And so he gave it the next grade up, AC+. And Wolfgang actually did the same. His 1987 test piece, Wall Street, had actually been given 11-. That's on the UIAA scale. And through translation, it became the first 8C or 14B in the world. So when he finished Action Directe, he didn't skip over a grade to make it harder than Hubble. He did, in fact, give it the next logical grade up, 11. And here's where it gets weird, because when we translate that, Action Directe is suddenly assigned a slash grade, 8C+/9A or 14C/14D. But for Wolfgang, it was just the next grade, the next logical level. And this makes sense. Jumping past grades is a strange thing to claim, since we don't know the boundaries of a grade that hasn't been established. We only vaguely understand the boundaries of established grades. Has it happened that someone was so far ahead of the world that they leapt over an entire grade? Sure. Is it commonplace? No. In Andrew McFarlane's film of Buster Martin doing Hubble, titled, quite as the Brits would say cheekily, Hubble, the world's first 9A, Ben Moon said this.
AC was around about sort of the maximum level that had been climbed in 1990 when I did Hubble. So to sort of jump 2 grades and give it 9A would have been a little bit arrogant maybe. So, yeah, it seemed obvious to give it AC+. I mean, it seemed a pretty big deal to give it AC+, to be honest, because there weren't any AC pluses around.
And besides, giving a grade is already challenging enough. The climb was harder, sure, but how much harder? How much of the equation comes down to style? And did you find the best beta? And what if a better pair of shoes or a knee bar makes it a little easier? You only have your own experience to rely on. And at the time, when there were only a handful of established 14Bs, well, it was impossible to know where 14C began, not to mention where it blended into the next grade. And when I recently spoke with Adam Ondra, who you'll hear from later this season, he had this to say.
In general, when making first ascents, I would say it's better to rather be careful. And maybe when you are not really sure whether it's a lower grade or higher grade, maybe it's better to go for the lower grade, because the danger of maybe not finding the best possible beta is quite high, especially today with maybe different tactics, different gear like knee pads. It's even though you're a really good knee bar climber, it's pretty easy to miss some knee scum, something that doesn't really help so much, but might really just lower down the intensity of the whole route. So I think because of that, I tend to be rather careful when proposing a grade.
So the grades given to Hubble and Action Directe actually make perfect sense. And over time, as the routes see more repeats, they'll inevitably settle out to something more accurate, sort of. If we believe that unbiased consensus can ever actually be reached, which, because of all the forces pushing and pulling our opinions, I'm not really convinced of. And I think it's worth mentioning here that while the grades of these routes are in question, and they're sort of positioned against each other, the two humans involved have never had anything but respect for each other and each other's accomplishments. They had met when Ben was quite young, living on the dole, and was just about to break through. Wolfgang, already a legend, noticing the condition of the rope Ben was climbing on, gave him a newer rope of his own. And when Ben would later write his scathing argument against overgrading, it was Wolfgang who he held up in the highest of regard. And in fact, Ben did travel to the Frankengura to try Wolfgang's route, and he came close, but was stopped by a finger injury. He's quoted in Tilman Hepp's book, Wolfgang Gulich, A Life in the Vertical, as saying, "It is, in all certainty, the hardest route in the world. I can imagine that it could be a 9A. I would grade it at least 8C+/9A. Actually, I'm not in a position to give an honest grade to this astonishing feat." At the same time, Wolfgang was making plans to travel to Raventor in the fall to try Hubble. "Maybe I have a chance on it," he modestly told Hepp. But soon after, Wolfgang died in a solo car accident. So we'll never know if he would have managed Hubble, or what he might have thought of the comparisons being made between the two routes today. And in fact, this isn't really about Ben Moon and Wolfgang Gulich at all. It's about us, about how we like to know who did what first, who owns the record, who conquered a thing. And I'm not sure that's what this should be about. But then again, I haven't climbed these routes, so I'm not at all really qualified to make judgments on them. But there are two people who are qualified above all others to make these comparisons. Interestingly enough, one is British, one is German. One is sponsored by Ben Moon. One is arguably the torchbearer for Wolfgang's legacy in the Frankengura as well as worldwide. And yes, of course, this creates some bias. And while they have some slightly disagreeing opinions, they actually agree on a lot of the main points. And honestly, after researching these two routes extensively, as well as the context that led up to them and what their legacies are, I'm going to give you my opinions as well. You can do with that what you will. We'll be right back with Buster Martin and Alex Megos. All right, let's face it. Those climbers in the 90s, 30 years ago, had stronger fingers than most of us. And that's because they spent a lot of time hanging on small wooden edges. And you can too. Tension Climbing has a full line of hangboards and finger strength tools designed with purpose to help you train for your goals. My personal favorites are the Hone Stone and the Whetstone for hanging, and the Block for lifting and warming up my fingers at the crag. The Hone Stone and the Whetstone cover everything you need in your home setup for people of different levels, one-arm or two-arm training, big edges, small edges, pockets, and slopers. And no matter what you're climbing on at the crag, the Block will get you ready. If you go to tensionclimbing.com and use the code STONE at checkout, you'll get 10% off, and you'll also let them know how much you appreciate them supporting this podcast, climbing history, and this community. That's STONE, S-T-O-N-E, all lowercase or all caps if you feel like shouting it out. Doesn't really matter how you do it, just do it. Okay, so this is a complicated conversation. But let's start with the brief history of how both of these routes, if not given 9A by the first ascensionists, ended up as contenders for the first in the world. Tilman Hepp reports in his biography of Wolfgang that Wolfie was sure Action Directe was a new level, and Tilman urged him to say so. The thing is, 11 was a new level for him, so he was being as accurate as he could have been. In the book, however, Hepp does disparage the folks who, without having climbed the route, printed the lower grade. And maybe because we now have this idea that a slash grade is somehow disrespectful, we just quickly latched on to the 9A. Why can't we give a route of that caliber a slash grade?
Oh no, I don't like the slash grades. I don't know about that. then you're just creating a whole nother grading system, because then is it a soft 8C plus / 9A, or is it a hard 8C plus / 9A? And then do you add like another slash on it to get like 8C plus / 9A / 9A? It's confusing.
That's Buster Martin. And throughout this interview, you'll hear Buster do something really fascinating. He makes his point, and then he makes a counterpoint to his point. I love it. He's the perfect podcast guest. And now, I've heard lots of rumors about where the 9A was first unequivocally given, but I haven't been able to confirm a single one of them. I suspect that the official upgrade was due to a couple of other factors. Certainly Wolfgang's death played a part in it, but also the fact that it took 4 years for a repeat, having turned away many of the best climbers in the world, including Ben Moon, Gilbert Tribou, and Alexander Huber. In comparison, Hubble had been repeated fairly quickly, twice within 4 years. And though there had likely long been talk of Hubble being harder than 8C+, I think we can point the finger at one person who brought it to the forefront.
You know what it was? I think the discussion first came about when Ondra's tried Hubble on multiple occasions, and I think he said somewhere that he thought it was 9A, and then since then it's just sort of settled at 9A, and now since then pretty much everyone has agreed on 9A, which I think is kind of funny, because I always was brought up being told that you don't really comment on the grade until you've done it, because maybe Ondra was missing maybe in this instance Ondra was missing a trick or something like that.
And or conditions, or who knows.
Conditions. Yeah.
Now, let's keep in mind that when Ondra tried Hubble, he was the Adam Ondra of the 2010s, having only done a few 9Bs, and he only tried in bad conditions, and rapid-fired 5 times to the last hold of the crux. So his perspective is likely a little skewed by that. But it's still the perspective of the person with the most experience at that grade of anyone.
Yeah, it's funny. It's hard to know when somebody has if someone has a huge amount of experience at a grade, whether it's helpful for them to grade it accurately or whether it just makes you totally lose perspective.
So both routes have settled at 9A. They've reached consensus, so to speak. On paper, Action Directe has a very clear consensus at 9A. But what about Hubble? Having started out at 8C+, and over the years seeing fewer repeats, it's at an extreme disadvantage.
Yeah. This is the thing with the consensus of Hubble being 9A, is because there is less ascents. It's like a smaller sample size. Imagine you're looking at a paper and you see this amount of significant difference in these two groups, but it was a sample size of 10 compared to the sample size of 30 who all agree and who all saw improvement. It's kind of a different story. So there does appear to be a consensus on Hubble, but less people have done it. So it's a much less solid consensus than Action Directe, where everyone who's done it has agreed on 9A, which kind of adds to the debate or the uncertainty.
And we also have to take into account what you mentioned earlier, which is early on, there was just you take the grade.
Yeah.
You don't argue about what the grade is.
Yeah.
And there's always been a reluctance to upgrade things. We want to keep things really hard. So those first several ascents of Hubble were probably reluctant to say, oh, I think it might actually be 9A.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned earlier, while consensus might be the best we have for now, I just don't believe we're ever actually reaching an unbiased conclusion. But for what it's worth, both routes now seem to be recognized as 9A. So I guess the logical thing is to try to compare them against each other. Which is harder?
Well, that's always a tricky and difficult question. But yeah, you're very right. They are super hard to compare.
That's Alex Megos, but I suspect you already knew that.
I would put Action Directe more into the power endurance corner, with having 16 moves, roughly 16 moves. And apart from maybe the jump move, they're all relatively similar difficulty. Whereas Hubble has like 4 hard moves and that's it. So right off the ground, I think if you do the first 7 moves off the ground on Hubble, you have climbed the route, which is not the case with Action Direct. So it's very, very hard to compare them. And I do also feel that although every hard climb obviously is condition dependent, even though I don't want to admit that often.
Yeah, I heard it right here.
Yeah.
Conditions matter.
Yeah, unfortunately they do. It kind of sucks, but the older you get, you realize that they kind of do matter at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
I do have a feeling that on Hubble conditions matter much, much more, just because there's like this one particular hold, like quite a slopey, small crimp, and on that particular hold, it makes a huge difference whether you've got good conditions or bad conditions. That's why I'm always like struggling to give Hubble like a good grade, and I always said back then, I'm gonna repeat that now, like in good conditions, it's for sure not harder than 8C plus, and in bad conditions, it can definitely be harder than 9A.
So I think Hubble is really distilled difficulty, and it's a very technical piece of climbing within these 6 or 7 moves. And then Action Direct has got much easier moves on it, but it's more of like a pure power endurance test piece. So it is hard to compare the two of them. And to be completely honest, I wouldn't be able to tell you which route I think is harder. I really don't know.
You said you can't say which route is harder, but can you say which route was harder for you?
Yeah, Hubble was much more of a challenge for me, but I think that it was just down to the nature of the climbing. I think that Hubble was very knacky, and it's a very technical piece of climbing, and it maybe didn't suit me as much, whereas Action Direct suits me perfectly. Like 15 move power endurance on a steep wall on pockets. It's kind of like my ideal climbing style. And then, like you mentioned earlier, there was time between me climbing Hubble and Action Direct, almost 2 years. So in that time, obviously my climbing had progressed.
You just used the word knacky. Is that right? Did you say knacky?
Knacky, yeah.
I don't know this term. I assume it's like fiddly and...
Like fiddly.
Hard to get just right.
Exactly. You sort of have to work out the knack of doing the move. So it's like when something's fiddly or beta intensive or just like a little bit weird, low percentage.
I like it. I'm going to start using that term now. Knacky.
Yeah, so Hubble is technical, and I was able to go on a trip to Germany and climb Action because it's like more of a basic style. However, I think that my ascent of Hubble was due to having spent a lot of time climbing in the Peak District on that limestone, and I think it was the same for Ben. I think Megos is the only person who's come on a trip and done it, and it kind of speaks for himself. He's like one of the best sport climbers in the world, so he was able to just turn up and do it. But I think for everyone else, they'd spent a lot of time climbing on that rock already.
So, okay, comparing the two is nearly impossible. Buster isn't sure which is harder, and Megos says that he's sure Hubble's only 8C plus in the best conditions, but could be much harder in bad conditions. And we have to keep in mind that it's in an area notorious for bad conditions. So do we grade it with the 1 day a year perfect conditions in mind, or with the usual okay conditions? I've always been of the opinion that you grade on the easiest possible way to do a route in perfect conditions, but I'm not entirely sure that's fair. One of the ways we try to discern difficulty when comparing routes is to compare how many tries each took. But this is an incredibly flawed system.
Both Alex and myself, I think we both did Action quicker, but I don't really think that tells you anything about the difficulty. I think that maybe it's just a contrast in styles. I think Hubble's much more of a tricky climb. It's much more about body positioning and really getting things right, whereas I think Action has quite basic moves on it, but basic doesn't mean that it's easier. It's just they're a bit simpler to work out. It's like, have you got the strength or not? So it doesn't really tell us much to consider any of that information, really.
I have to ask you this as the other person who's done these two routes. When you watched the video of Alex Megos doing Hubble, were you as astounded as I was at the way he locks down every move?
Yeah, he looks really strong in it, doesn't he? It's really cool. And I think the sequence he's using, it seems like, very, very impressive. I think I heard that Malcolm Smith was able to, we spoke about this last time we were chatting, he was able to chalk up on the crux moves. I also heard that he had to be carried to the crag because he hadn't been fueling himself too well. And
Wow.
if you saw the walk in, I mean, it's like a 30-second walk in, but rumor has it, like his dad and his brother had to carry him to the base of the cliff.
Yeah, maybe a tactic best left behind.
Left in the 80s and 90s, yeah.
Absolutely. So ultimately, it seems like both routes are right there in the same ballpark. Which brings me to another question. Does how the first ascensionists did it matter? What if they used a harder sequence than was later found? Does that count for something? Does the route remain at that level?
I mean, people say if you would probably repeat the original beta that Wolfgang did on Action Direct, you would probably have climbed 9A plus nowadays.
And you'll remember when I talked with Ben Cossey, we discussed Wolfgang's original sequence and how much harder it really is.
If anyone has a Wolfgang book, you'll know in the Action Direct chapter, there's a photo of him right hand in that mono like Alex, but his left arm is under his right arm. It's not over. So he hasn't the rows. Seemingly, and this is my theory, is that he's gone up there maybe and crossed over or done some sort of crossover to the mono, which, oh boy, it's like not easy.
And now, Hubble's sequence has also gotten slightly easier. The knee bar and knee pad that Buster and I discussed in the first conversation with him. And now, Ben didn't use the knee bar, and neither did Alex Megos in his quick and casual send, but most folks feel it's 9A, even if you have the knee pad on. But Hubble was Ben's best style, and Wolfgang had been training specifically for Action Direct. I think we all understand that it's easy to undergrade something when it suits us perfectly. When I spoke with Steve McClure, he brought up a great point while discussing his route Mutation, a possible contender for the first 9B, all the way back in 1998.
I think with that route, with my route Mutation, it very much suited me. Very, very much. I mean, there was even talk that it might be even a grade harder than what Will upgraded it to. But if that was the case, then it wasn't for me because it suited me and it certainly suited my style. And it suited my strengths at the time. And to be honest, if it is 15A, it probably wasn't 15A for me, if that makes sense. So, yeah, that's where the grades all start to become a little bit messy once you hit that sort of cutting edge.
So we have to wonder, if Hubble was Ben's style, did it feel 9A to him? We know those boundaries hadn't yet been explored, so in retrospect, maybe. But in a mid-90s article from On the Edge magazine, Ben argued vehemently that Hubble could not be 9A, and Action Direct may not be either. He writes, during an interview with Heinz Zach a few months back, the topic of hard routes arose, and of which were the hardest. There are a whole batch of routes up there vying for the hardest route in the world title, and obviously it's very hard to say which it is, particularly when not a month passes and we hear of a new super route with a big grade. However, I felt and still feel that Action Direct is the most worthy contender, and thus expressed my opinion. He goes on to explain that this is due to Wolfgang's track record, and after he warns the rest of the top climbers that what he's about to say is going to hurt their feelings, he writes, I have to repeat my belief that both Action Directe and Hubble are 8C+. The only person who suggested otherwise was the climber and journalist Tilman Hepp in his biography of Wolfgang Gulich. His opinion must surely be questionable. And then, after skewering pretty much every other climber who has suggested AC Plus or 9A for their routes, bringing up routes like Ohm, Bain des Sang, Hughes, Super Plafond, and Just Do It, he finishes with, I know that for a lot of people this is going to be hard to take, but unless you move Action Directe and Hubble up to 9A, which they just are not, there's no room for all these routes to go in at the same grade. This article is wild. I'll likely be telling you more about it later this season, but essentially, it's Ben speaking his mind. Honestly, it's fairly respectful, but he's not afraid to voice his doubts. And then everyone gets a chance to respond. It's fantastic. But the biggest problem with almost any conversation like this is that if you have 4 people talking, you're going to get 4 different views of a grade. Because like we all know, but then try to ignore a lot of the time, grades are very subjective. And once we recognize that subjectivity, how do we decide on a first of anything? And, then there's also this weird question of like, if grades are subjective and, a 9A for somebody might be AC plus for someone else, it might be 9A plus for someone else.
Yeah.
Do we all get our own personal first 9A in the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's funny how this thing with grading has changed, because I remember it used to sort of be like you get what you're given and you take the grade that's given in the guidebook. But now with social media and sort of like online logbooks, people are speaking out about what they think, and you can kind of just decide like, this felt like this for me, this is what it is. But then how do you know that maybe you were having a bad day, or this was just a route that didn't suit you? We can't, if we find something hard, we can't always just upgrade it. And that's kind of how I always saw Hubble. So up until I did it, I always saw it as like an 8C+. I didn't really know, to be honest, because I hadn't clipped the chains. I hadn't climbed from bottom to top. But even before there was any talk of it being upgraded, it still represented this sort of like gradeless difficulty in my head. Like maybe it was 8C+, but it was just like one of those savage routes that is where the grade sort of doesn't mean anything. You need to be this next level climber to get up it. So it's kind of hard to know. However, maybe the same thing happened with Action. So maybe it got called 9A in the magazine or in the autobiography, and then after that, everyone took 9A. And because it was considered the first 9A, maybe no one's ever. I'm not saying for 1 second that I think it's 8C+, but this could also be a factor where no one would ever say that they think it's another grade, because it's so firmly in people's head as the first 9A. Although I think it is 9A, absolutely.
And here's another thing. Ben wasn't just arguing that Hubble was definitely 8C+. He was also saying that Hubble and Action Directe are the same grade. He admits that Action Directe might be harder, but they're still the same grade. And maybe Ben was right all along, because the grading scale has certainly shifted. Not many people will argue that for whatever reason, older routes have stiffer grades. Notice how Alex says nowadays here.
I mean, people say if you would probably repeat the original beta that Wolfgang did on Action Directe, you would probably have climbed 9A plus nowadays.
What do we make of that? Do we go back and retroactively change the record books based on what a climb would have felt like if gyms were everywhere and training knowledge had been as robust as it is now? Not to mention, we're now grading things at a time when there are thousands of 8Cs, 8C pluses, 9As, and harder to gain experience on. There were less than 10 routes in the world at that level back then. Not to mention, if we're doing this sort of revisionist history, we have to go back and question if Hubble, with the knee pad and knee bar, under the old grading system, would have still gotten 9A. It gets really, really messy. Do we really go back and change those record books? I decided to look in two places to see how this sort of thing has been handled elsewhere. When the world moves forward, how do sports and music handle their beloved records? And I settled on two examples. And let's be perfectly honest here, I cherry-picked these two examples to fit my narrative. You're welcome to go find others and form your own opinion, and feel free to argue. I'm all for it. Number 1. In 1979, the NBA adopted the three-point shot. And this was halfway through Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's career. And he's not considered a good three-point shooter, well, because there was no reason for him to be. In all of his developmental years, there was no three-point shot. Further shots didn't count for more, so why try them? And when LeBron James, who played his entire career with a three-point shot option, passed Kareem to take the top spot on the all-time scoring list, the NBA didn't go back and adjust for how it might have been if Kareem had played in a similar era. LeBron is just in first place. Period. Number 2. Drake recently tied Michael Jackson as the male solo artist with the most number one singles in Billboard history. But the fact is, they're playing different games on the same scoreboard. Drake is playing at a time when streams are counted rather than just physical album sales and radio play. People can listen essentially for free at any time to any song they want instead of having to go to the store and spend their money in order to listen. And I don't think anyone would argue that Drake's music will have the same lasting impact that Michael or the Beatles have had, but the record books still put him in their company. So, many institutions and organizations with much higher stakes don't retroactively change the record books when the rules or the way those records are scored go through a change. Even a dramatic change. So, should we be looking back into the past to change the records of a first of a grade that were set in stone many years ago? And here's another wrench in the works for you to ponder. If we take into account that neither climber gave their route 9A, should the credit actually go to the route originally given 9A by its first ascensionist? One that's held the grade anyway. Because if so, Wolfgang and Ben Moon aren't even in the conversation anymore. That would mean it comes down to Ohm by Alex Huber and then Bain de Sang by Fred Nicole. I can feel a lot of you shaking your heads now. You don't like that idea. Well, honestly, neither do I, for a few reasons. And actually, I think we're still looking at it the wrong way. I think our need for black and white and clarity and simple answers has steered us away from the answers that matter the most. We'll be right back. What's up, everybody? I just wanted to drop in here to say thank you. Projects like this take way too many hours to make, and it just doesn't happen without your support. So whether it's training plans, courses, or products, it's your support of Power Company Climbing, as well as our sponsors here on this show, that has given me the time and motivation to conceptualize and create things like this podcast. So as a thank you, we're offering 20% off of almost everything on our site. Finger files, clippers, apparel, proven plans, ebooks, courses, and more. For details, go to powercompanyclimbing.com/stone. And then use the code STONE, that's STONE, at checkout. powercompanyclimbing.com. Learn, grow, excel. On May 6th, 1954, a 25-year-old medical student named Roger Bannister, being paced by two friends at a track in Oxford, becomes the first human to run a mile in less than 4 minutes, doing so in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. The record had stood at 4 minutes, 1 second for nearly a decade. And popular opinion was that this new record might stand longer. But 6 weeks later, at a track meet in Finland, Australian middle distance runner John Landy goes even faster. 3 minutes, 57.9 seconds. Not quite 2 months later, the two meet at the Empire Games in Vancouver, Canada, for a race. And for the first time in history, two men run under 4 minutes in one race. Bannister wins. And if we only look at the records, it takes 3 years for someone to advance the record by 0.4 seconds. But that would be missing the point. What matters is that in those 3 years, 17 more people ran faster than 4 minutes. And in fact, just over 1 year after the barrier had been initially crossed, 3 additional runners did it in one race. So why, if 4 minutes and 1 second was the record for 9 years, are there suddenly 20 people who can beat it? Well, we call that a send train. We've seen time and time again that when some imaginary door is opened, it's much easier for people to walk through. So when Wolfgang climbed Wall Street, it became that much easier for Fred Nicole and Ben Moon to climb the grade. And when Ben climbed 8C+, it opened the door for Wolfgang to do his next level climb. And what allowed Alex Huber and Fred Nicole to say 9A for their routes was the hype around Action Directe, the admiration for Wolfgang, the knowledge that a new level had been opened up for all climbers to someday explore. It's because someone said, here is where the imaginary boundary lies. So the big remaining question, I suppose, is, does it even matter which was the first 9A?
I don't think it matters which route's harder, but I do think it matters which route was the first 9A, otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation. And people really care. People really care. And I think for the sake of the history books, it kind of makes sense. However, I think that Hubble is 9A. And I really couldn't see any argument for Action being a different grade to Hubble. I think they're probably quite similar in difficulty. But I don't want that to take away from what Action represents, which is this step up in difficulty, and it's this what Wolfgang did with all of his training and this beautiful piece of rock and such a strong athletic performance. And I think that sort of captured people's hearts and minds. And I don't like the idea that if Hubble is 9A, that it takes anything away from that. And I think that it shouldn't.
I feel like the thing is, even if Hubble gets upgraded to 9A, everybody will recognize Action Directe as the world's first 9A because that's how it has been back then, and the history will not change. So, yeah, I mean, it's nice that you can take 9A if you climb Hubble, but I feel like you shouldn't focus on that. You should focus on climbing Hubble because of the history, no matter what the grade is. Same with Action Directe. But we're humans and we're so focused on numbers that we always want to have a letter and a number behind everything. That's like human nature because we want to make everything measurable. But I feel like with those classic routes, like there should not even be a grade that's put behind the name, you know, like the name should stand for itself. Same with routes like biography or to bolt or not to be and those kind of things. They don't need a grade, they only need a name.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that you're someone who has been designated a first. You know, you were the first to on-site 9A, and it's an interesting opportunity to ask you, how much does it matter what the record books say versus what you actually did? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good question. Well, of course, if you want to make a living off of climbing, it also matters what the record book says. But
Yeah.
like for like personal satisfaction, like I'm way more proud of some things that I have done that will never even show up in the record books than things that might have been milestones in the climbing history, just because for me personally they have a bigger value or I have invested more time in them. But that's something that's very personal, and I feel like that
Yeah.
might be for every climber. Like I'm sure, for example, every climber who's done Action Direct, like that ascent will matter more than an ascent of like some random 9A anywhere. It's
Yeah.
even though on paper it doesn't really make any difference grade wise, but it's like the personal feelings connected to your own achievement. So
Yeah, and I think we look at both of those routes, Action Direct and Hubble, and any ascent of either route still makes news.
for sure, I
And there
mean,
aren't many routes of that grade that do that.
exactly. Stefano just came recently to the Frank Nero to
Yeah.
repeat Action Direct, and I mean, I have been climbing with him on it when he tried it first. I think I don't even know. It was a while ago. It was like for sure 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. I can't even remember. But if it would have been any 9A, I'm sure he would have not bothered to come back for it. But with this one,
Yeah.
he came back because it mattered.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that he left from trying his 15D project to come and do a 14D.
Yeah.
And the 14D makes news, and he makes multiple posts about it because it's this historical icon.
For sure.
So,
I'm not even sure, did he put a grade on his post? Probably not. I mean, most people don't. You're just like the name stands for itself.
I went and looked it up after Alex said this, and he's right. Stefano did not put a grade on any of his posts about Action Direct. The only place a grade appears is in a collaboration post with a sponsor that was clearly written by the sponsor. And I quite like Alex's suggestion of no grades. I don't use grades in my gym, and I love it. But let's be honest, that's not going to fly. But it did get me thinking that maybe the debate is actually a good thing. Hear me out here. The fact that shuffling the grade of Hubble then changes the first 8C plus as well as the first 9A, and that Ondra would later regrade an Alex Huber route as the first 15A, usurping biography or realization, and that Huber would say he originally graded it based on Action Direct being 8C plus. Well, all of these debates do a fantastic job of highlighting the subjectivity of grades. Once you've engaged in the conversation, you just can't ignore it.
Yeah, it makes it a good conversation, but it also puts things in perspective because nobody really knows and it is all subjective. It kind of makes it a little bit more fun and you don't really know, so it doesn't really matter. And I think keeping that in mind makes you do things for the right reason and climb these routes because of what they mean to climbing history and because of what they mean to you personally, rather than a number assigned by somebody else or by a group of other people. Although with these two routes, it does bear some sort of significance due to their place in history. But for me, and I think for most of the other people climbing these routes, they don't care about the grade. It's like they want to climb this icon, they want to climb the name, they want to climb it for the history. And whether or not they get to put another 9A on their scorecard, I don't think matters.
For sure. I mean, Adam Pustelnik actually, he put it quite well, I think, in the 25th anniversary of Action Direct. Like they tried to invite all the repeaters of Action Direct, and Adam Pustelnik was there too. And then it came out that it was like the only 9A he climbed, and he said, well, it's because I didn't want to climb 9A. I wanted to climb Action Direct. And it didn't matter if it would have been, 8B, 8C, or 9B. He wanted to climb it because of the name, because of the history. So he said, like, in his eyes, he didn't climb 9A, he climbed Action Direct, and that's what mattered.
It is the history, the characters, and the way these routes have inspired so many people that matters.
Exactly. That's why I'm making this podcast to begin with, because it's the stories and characters that matter. I mean, sure, we're trying to get the facts right about who did what, or who put the bolts in, or whose idea a thing was, etc., etc. But mostly, it's the spirit of the thing we want to convey, whether that's adventure or personal challenge, or making a statement, or fighting a stereotype, or whatever it is. That's the most important part for me, the spirit. But maybe the most fun part of all of this is that you're right. Whatever your opinion, it's easy to make a case for it. Was Hubble the first 9A? Yes. Was Action Directe the first 9A? Yes. Maybe we all do get our own personal first 9A in the world after all. Some of you are shaking your heads again. But with that in mind, the larger cultural conversation, here's where I stand on the question of Action Directe versus Hubble. Sort of. See, the pressure to break barriers is real. And if a person accidentally breaks that barrier, good on them. But the person who's under the pressure to break a barrier, even if that pressure is self-imposed and still delivers, that person deserves immense credit. Ben and Wolfgang both were in that position, just on different grading scales that delivered an injustice in translation and comparisons. We have to do it, but that doesn't make it any more just. So my opinion, I don't care which is harder. That's going to vary person to person, day to day, based on preferred style, temperature, humidity, skin conditions, etc. I don't really care that one was before the other. I think the two, Action Directe and Hubble, are now inseparable, forever intertwined as a symbol of the massive leap in the standards of climbing difficulty taking place at the dawn of the 1990s. At the hands of some of the sport's all-time greatest climbers.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. At the link in your show notes, you'll find all the things you expect, and probably some you don't, including links to all of my references for this episode. Special thanks to Alex Megos and Buster Martin for being willing to discuss grades when I know it's the most over-discussed topic in climbing, well, maybe other than hangboarding. And thanks to our other special guests, Adam Ondra, Steve McClure, Ben Cossey, and to Andrew McFarland for letting me use that clip of Ben Moon from his film. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym. Follow the pod on your friends' phones and share it all over your social medias, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time.